Hi class, welcome to our video on gender and behavior, where you're going to be learning about gender role expectations. What will you be learning about in this video? You're going to be learning about some of the key elements of the traditional male role and some of the common problems associated with the traditional male role. And then you're going to be learning about the major expectations of the female role and some of the common problems associated with this role. So let's get started. So what are the effects of these stereotypes? Well, they contribute to what we think of as the male role and the female role. And the male role affects how men oftentimes and boys think they need to be behaving and what they need to be doing. And so the male role is comprised of achievement, aggression, autonomy, sexuality, and stoicism. And so stoicism meaning being unemotional. And so think about then the pressures associated with these with these attributes. If you feel like you need to be a high achiever, higher, if you feel like you need to be higher than average, which is what the male role would be comprised of, that's a lot of pressure. Or that you need to be aggressive. What if it's not in your nature? Or what if you don't want to be aggressive? Why should you feel pressured to be? What if you don't want to be autonomous? What if you want to be more interdependent? What about sexuality? What if you don't want to have multiple sexual partners and you want to have a committed, long-term, monogamous relationship and your friends aren't that way? Perhaps they think that's not how you should be. Perhaps they've been socialized. Perhaps there's biological reasons, but then think about the pressures that males experience. Go back to our earlier chapter where we looked at the effects of holding in emotions on health and well-being. And so stoicism can negatively affect health. So you can see here a little cartoon that shows, you're a good girlfriend. I wish I was a good boyfriend. It's just that I get nervous around you. I always think I'll screw up. You stupid pig. Chicks don't like that. Chicks like guys who are confident. I always know I'll screw up. So he's opening up about his feelings, but yet and this is stereotypical, this is not how I'm saying many girls respond or women respond, but if she's affected by the male role and then she thinks that he needs to be more confident, for example, more aggressive, or have any of these other attributes, then how is he going to behave? Is he going to hold in his emotions? Or how's he going to view himself when he does express his feelings? There's this contradiction where women want men to be open, but yet they feel pressure, men do, to not be open about their feelings. So it can be difficult for some men. So for men, some specific problems associated with the male role include a pressure to succeed. This can include a lot of stress, and this is particularly true for African American and Hispanic men, especially when we think about racism and discrimination and barriers to entry to employment that are based on race. This can make it even more stressful. Then there's the emotional realm, where there's a cultural emphasis on suppressing the expression of emotion. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this then can lead to stress-related disorders, and it can also create problems in relationships. Perhaps if she believes in the male role and they're in a heterosexual relationship and he believes in the male role, but yet she still wants him to express his emotions, this is very conflicting. Or perhaps she does not believe he should suppress his emotions, but he believes he should. He may not express his emotions, and then this can affect the relationship. Also, sexual problems can result from gender role expectations, an obsession with sexual performance that can interfere with sexual responsiveness. Men may confuse feelings of intimacy and sex. And then sexualization of intimacy can cause inappropriate anxiety when men feel affection for another man, thinking, that, oh, this affection must be related to sexuality, or I cannot have closeness because I will be, if the man is heterosexual, I will be misconstrued as being gay. And so this then can contribute to the promotion of homophobia, that intense fear and intolerance of homosexuality. Women experience gender role expectations as well, and the role expectations for females include the marriage mandate and the motherhood mandate. And these two expectations are focusing on heterosexual success, learning how to attract and interest males as prospective mates. And so there's a lot of pressure on women, young women as well, to meet this mandate. So think about the pressures that young women may feel to attract a mate and the lengths that they may go to and how they may attribute their personal value or self-worth to that ability to attract a mate, to attract a boyfriend, to to be physically attractive. And also, I think too, it's important to note that working outside the home has become an expectation for females, for many females, and this then results in a significant amount of pressure that women have as they want to be nurturing, caring mothers, especially when we think about the pressures on women to fulfill those or have those qualities, and then at the same rate to be successful in their job or in their career. So what are some of the problems with the female role? Well, one is diminished career aspirations. So research suggests that young women continue to have lower career aspirations than young men with comparable backgrounds. And this has been named the ability achievement gap. Many women worry that they'll be seen as less feminine and will not be able to attract a mate if they are too successful. Some women may feel pressure to downplay their success. Some women may feel as though they don't want to make it noticeable or make others aware that perhaps they have a more prestigious career or one where they make more money or that they have a higher level of education than their partner. So think about some alternatives to traditional gender roles. Our gender role identity, that's our identification with the qualities regarded as masculine and feminine. But many people don't want to conform to traditional gender roles, and they experience the strain and the pressure that I just mentioned to do so, as both males and females experience the male mandate and the female mandate. And in addition, relationship satisfaction is lower in heterosexual couples with traditional gender role identities. So it seems that by shifting our views about gender roles, we might not only experience less pressure, but we may have higher levels of relationship satisfaction. An important concept for us to think about that challenges traditional gender roles is androgyny. When we look at the word androgyny, we have two parts, andro meaning man and gyne or gyne meaning female. And this is the coexistence of both masculine and feminine personality traits in a single person. A person who is androgynous, in essence, has both traditional feminine characteristics and traditional masculine characteristics. And so individuals who have these traits or who have the traits or characteristics of androgyny, they are better able to be flexible when they experience stress. In addition, they seem to have better mental health and they seem to respond to stress in a much healthier way. Also, people who are in a relationship with someone who is androgynous or feminine report being happier. So there seems to be a benefit to not only the individual themselves, but to the partner of a person who is androgynous. I'm going to put a link on our course site for Sandra Bem's sex role inventory. You're not required to complete this, but you might be interested to see what this sex role inventory looks like, and you may decide that you want to see what your own tendency is. Do you tend to lean in the more of a direction of masculinity or femininity, or are you somewhere in the middle? Are you more androgynous? Your textbook does a nice job of showing you how Bem's sex role inventory considers or equates high femininity and high masculinity with androgyny. And you can also see the results of low femininity and high masculinity, and the results of having low femininity and low masculinity, and then high femininity and low masculinity. So again, I'll put the Bem's sex role inventory on our course website with this chapter, and I'd encourage you to at least take a look at it and perhaps take some time to complete it so you can see where you stand. Some individuals think that the concept of androgyny is still limiting, and this is because when we divide characteristics into masculine and feminine categories, we are really aligning ourselves still with gender role stereotypes. And some of you may have thought this as I was describing the concept of androgyny. And so we have an additional perspective, which is the gender role transcendence perspective. And this embraces moving beyond gender roles as a way of perceiving themselves and others. And then also you can see that it encourages the use of gender neutral terms such as instrumental and expressive. And if you'll remember at the beginning of this chapter, I described instrumentality and expressiveness. Instrumentality typically being associated with more masculine, traditionally masculine behaviors. And I don't mean masculine in the sense of what men do, but those that we may align with the stereotypes of masculinity, and those typically involve action. And then expressiveness involving expression, and such as like caring and nurturing and being emotional or sensitive. And so instead of thinking about masculinity and femininity, perhaps we need to remove that idea of separating people or traits based on characteristics that we are clearly relating to gender, and instead think about instrumentality and expressiveness. I wonder, what do you think? Do you think that this is perhaps a more well-developed way of thinking about gender roles and transcending gender roles? And when I say well-developed, I mean, is this a way of thinking about gender roles that is really perhaps better aligned with what the research suggests are the benefits of androgyny, and that when we are, and in addition, when we're focusing so heavily on gender role stereotypes, we know that there can be negative consequences. So even though androgyny suggests, this concept of androgyny suggests that if we are androgynous, we may be more resilient to stress and there are additional positive outcomes, we're still in that concept of androgyny conceptualizing and integrating the use of terms that are still associated with masculinity and femininity or stereotypes. Today, researchers are very interested in gender variance or gender nonconformity rather than gender labels. And transgender individuals are those whose sense of gender identity differs from their biological sex at birth, and they often reject gender labels. And there's also a new notion of gender fluidity, and this is the idea that gender is an unstable continuum and that it can vary over time. So let's take just a few moments for you to test yourself. Blank our cultural expectations about what is appropriate for each gender. Is it display roles, gender roles, primary sex characteristics, or secondary sex characteristics? If you selected gender roles, you're right. Remember, display roles is something you learned about in an earlier chapter, and this is related to emotional expression and the different cultural norms or rules for how we express emotions. And primary sex characteristics are those sex characteristics that are present at birth, whereas secondary sex characteristics are those that develop during and then after puberty. All right, let's look at this one. Which of the following actions contribute to traditional gender roles? Is it parents dressing boys and girls in similar colors? Is it parents purchasing gender-appropriate toys for their children? Is it parents encouraging similar leisure activities for boys and girls? Or is it being assigned household chores without regard to gender? If you selected parents purchasing gender-appropriate toys for their children, you are correct. Perhaps we could put gender-appropriate within quotations, because this is not to suggest that there are gender-appropriate toys, but we know that there are different beliefs that parents hold about what toys are most appropriate for their children. Many parents hold the belief that toys should not be determined, or the type of toy that a child plays with should not be based upon the child's gender, but we also know that there are parents too who believe that toys should be directed towards children based upon their gender. So that's why I have this statement here, gender appropriate toys. It's not necessarily that I or you have this absolute answer of what's gender appropriate. We don't. It varies from family to family, from individual to individual. I think that when we think about toys, it's really interesting for us to not only think about the types of toys, but the way that boys and girls may play with toys and why they may play with these toys in different ways. So, for example, what researchers have found is that when boys, for example, might build a construction set, they might build a castle and they'll play with the finished product oftentimes on the outside more so than what a girl would do. Whereas a girl, when she's building a construction set, she's more likely to play on the inside. So this is interesting. I would be curious to know, what do you think? And that's just an opportunity for you to think about why might there be these differences? Now, you may not have observed these differences, but remember, we're talking about just what the research has to say. So you may have unique individual experiences. It's interesting to think about why there may be some of these differences. So I wonder, is it that we may see sometimes that, and this is not necessarily as true today as it perhaps has been in generations past, but that boys were more encouraged or have been more encouraged to go outside. Now, when I was young, my parents wanted me to go outside, but I also was aware of some of the expectations for me as a girl. And I know that young girls today are as well, that girls are, are supposed to, there's more pressure on girls to have a particular physical appearance and to look pretty, to not get dirty than there would be on boys. I think you can even go out to clothing stores. If you have children, you know that there is a lot of variation for girls in terms of clothing and all the different opportunities to buy very different types of clothing, different styles. There's a lot of options so that children, that young girls can be more, choose more of have their own preferences. And then two, I think that the clothing overall is just more attractive. It's prettier clothing. And then for boys, it seems that there is not much variation, and a lot of the clothing is really encouraging physical activity. And while that is true that there's clothing encouraged for girls, that is revolving around physical activity, I think it's definitely disproportionate in its number. And I'm only saying this because of my experience in looking for boys and girls clothes, because I want my daughter to have a lot of clothes that are going to be great for her for being outside. And I found that it is a little bit harder for me to find sports clothes for her than it is for my sons. Now, of course, I can go to a sporting goods store and easily find that, but I'm just talking about like at a department store or if I were to go online to any major retailer. And so if I look at boys' clothes, I find it's really easy to find clothes that encourage outdoor play, but it's not nearly as easy to find clothes that are related to, dressing up. I think about even just Easter, for example. It seems like when I would go to the store, there might be just a couple of options for boys, and for girls, there's a tremendous number of options. So there are subtle messages in that. Now, it's not that companies are trying to impose messages, they're responding to the demand. But then this becomes a cycle. And when boys and girls go shopping with their mom or when parents go, this then shapes what they think as well. It is going to have an effect. To what degree? That's going to vary, of course, from individual to individual. And I wonder too, going back to the example of girls playing more often inside of those things than boys who are playing outside, I wonder, is this suggesting that boys may be more skillful at construction, whereas girls are better at keeping the inside in order? And so is it implicitly is it implicitly kind of causing girls to integrate that idea into their own way of thinking and to really have at a very early age an understanding of the distribution of tasks and labor between the two genders. Now, it's not that children are consciously, developing this and they're not saying, oh, this must be what I'm supposed to do. All of this is through that process of socialization. So girls are learning very right through all of the experiences that they have what it means to be a girl, and boys are learning those things as well. So this is that process of developing gender roles, that the things like being exposed to certain toys, what we see in the media, the conversations that we overhear our parents say or engage in, and the things that our parents may say to us, what we see our moms do, what we might see our dads do. And so we each have our own variation in what we think it means to be a boy versus what it means to be a girl. Here's another one. Which of the following is not considered a key element of the traditional male role? Is it autonomy, emotional sensitivity with women? Is it aggression, or is it stoicism? If you selected emotional sensitivity with women, you're right. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in class when we have had an on-campus class and had any discussion about the traditional male role, how often men in the class have said that they felt like that by expressing emotional sensitivity, it had meant that they were less masculine. Now, I would always have counterpoints where there would be males in the class who would say, I didn't feel that way. So there's always variation, of course, in how males feel. But I wonder about that pressure that men experience to maybe show more autonomy, to be more stoic, and to not express that emotional sensitivity. And what are women missing out on by not having that sensitivity being expressed by the men in their lives, and how much better it might be for all of us if we weren't as pressured by these expectations that we have related to gender. Here's another one. In earlier societies, gender roles were non-existent, were largely androgynous, constituted a division of labor, or were the opposite of modern roles. If you selected constituted a division of labor, you're right. And so it's definitely not that they were non-existent. We know that gender roles clearly existed in earlier societies, and we know that they were not largely androgynous. If you watch any films that are based on history, if you watch any series, you will very clearly see some of the very clear expectations for males and for females. And you can also find just in historical writings, you've probably learned about this in your history classes, in your humanities classes. And when we think about modern day, what we need to always remember is that modern day has within it remnants of history. And so when we want to look at why are we the way that we are, why do we hold some of the beliefs that we do, we can look back at our history. We can go back through those threads to learn more about ourselves as people. Difficulties in expressing emotions are most likely to occur in which of the following groups? Is it men with traditional attitudes, men with non-traditional attitudes, women with traditional attitudes, or women with non-traditional attitudes? If you selected men with traditional attitudes, you're right. Remember, those traditional attitudes that men hold cause men to feel more confined oftentimes to those gender role expectations. And we know that this can have an effect on men's mental health and their physical health. We know that when one has trouble expressing emotions or holds emotions inside, that this can, of course, lead to some feelings of anxiety. It can also have some physical impact, as this is a form of stress, and we know that stress can affect the immune system and one's overall health. So it's really to a male's advantage to express his emotions. So we need to think about ourselves as a society and the messages that are being promoted to men about expressing emotions. And while we are seeing these differences, we're seeing that more men, or we're seeing more media encouraging men through their films, through television series, through any sort of programming that you'll find, or just online in general. You're seeing a lot of change, and it's happened pretty rapidly. we have to think that although for many of you who are young people in this class, you're exposed to a lot of these newer ways of thinking, you could go back just a generation or go 2 generations back and think about the messages that men received about how important it was to live within those gender role expectations and to align oneself with those traditional male roles, and then how this might affect one's overall health. And let's think too about how this might even make men more reluctant who are from those earlier generations or who hold those more traditional attitudes. That might make them more reluctant to seek psychological help when they need it. Here's another one. Which of the following statements best reflects the effect that television has on gender roles socialization? Is it contributes to traditional stereotypes? Is it tends to combat traditional stereotypes? Is it reinforces traditional stereotypes more for girls than for boys? Or is it that regular programming has no effect, but commercials reinforce stereotypes? So remember, when you think about these questions, you need to rely on what the research has to say because we each have our own individual experiences. For example, some of you may be more inclined to watch television shows that have people who are really combating or people who are living in ways that don't align with traditional stereotypes. So you may then be more often exposed to that and then have the belief that that's what television looks like. But when researchers look at television, they're looking across the board in a way that hopes to eliminate bias so that they get a really overall general picture of what's taking place. So what does the research have to say? If you selected that it contributes to traditional stereotypes, you're right. We know that television does not tend to combat traditional stereotypes overall. Now, there are certainly individual programs that do, but if we look overall at all programming, we see that it does not tend to. It leans more on the side of contributing to traditional stereotypes. We also know that the television programs that are even available today, that we don't see a disproportionate emphasis on the stereotypes being emphasized for girls versus boys. We see traditional stereotypes of both girls and boys being reinforced. So there's not an uneven distribution. Again, you may watch individual shows and find that there is variation among the shows that you've seen. But this is based upon overall the television shows that are out there. How are gender roles reinforced? What messages are being promoted? Now, here's an item that requires that you reflect back on our last video and reflect back on the reasons that some of the differences that we see between males and females exist. So you learned about the brain and you learned about some of the brain differences between males and females. And in learning about the brain, you learned about the different types of processing that's taking place in each of the hemispheres. So here's the statement that you need to complete. The left hemisphere is more actively involved in blank and mathematic processing, whereas the right hemisphere is specialized to handle blank processing. So you might want to pause this for a moment, reflect, perhaps look back at your notes, and then move on to the next slide. If you selected verbal and then visual spatial, you're right. So the left hemisphere is more actively involved in verbal and mathematic processing, whereas the right hemisphere is specialized to handle visual spatial processing. So what have you learned about gender role expectations? You've learned about the key elements of the traditional male role and some of the common problems associated with this role. And then you learned about the major expectations of the female role and common problems associated with the female role. There's a lot of application to these concepts. Think about the application of these concepts to your own life, and then think about yourselves going into a helping profession and being aware of the pressure that both males and females feel in regards to fulfilling that male or female role and how this may affect one's mental health. And then we can also think about what power we have as individuals to promote healthy understandings about what it means to be male and what it means to be female, and how when there is a lot of pressure that males and females experience, the more narrowly we define these roles, the more negatively we may affect an individual's mental health later on.